You're listening to World Class from the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. We bring expertise on international affairs from Stanford's campus straight to you. I'm Michael McFall, host of World Class and director of the Freeman Spogli Institute. With President-elect Joe Biden and his team moving forward on a transition to the White House, countries around the world are waiting with anticipation for what might be a very different U.S. approach to foreign policy over the next 4 years. We're going to devote the next several sessions of World Class to discussing these possible differences, as well as continuities in U.S. foreign policy around the world. Today, we begin with China and Asia more broadly. And our guest is one of, it says in my notes, but I think you may be the newest faculty member at FSI, Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro. Oriana is a center fellow affiliated with both our Asia Pacific Research Center and our Center for International Security and Cooperation. We are thrilled that she is with us, at least virtually today, and more generally here at Stanford. Her research focuses on Asia Pacific security issues broadly, as well as Chinese military and security policy. Dr. Mastro also serves in the US Air Force Reserve and works as a strategic planner at the United States Indo-Pacific Command. Welcome to the podcast, Oriana. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with the end of the Trump era and then get to Biden. The State Department just released what some are calling a Cannon-esque strategy for how to deal with China. What do you think of this strategy paper? What do you think it's right? Is it going in the right direction? And will it have any influence on what the next administration might do moving forward?
You know, I'm not sure if anyone's calling it Kennan-esque besides the people who wrote it. But the main thing about this paper is it outlines the many challenges that the United States faces when it's trying to compete with China. Of course, this is important. I would actually say one of the biggest or most important things the Trump administration has done was release that 2017 national security strategy, which clearly said that we were in a strategic competition with China.
Right.
But we're now past the point of just sort of saying this over and over and over again. I think we're at the point where we actually want to do something about it. And one of my biggest complaints about this administration is they've basically done everything they could to make sure we weren't in a good position to compete. So there's nothing really in that paper that then tells us, how are we actually going to do this? How are we going to win this competition? How are we going to be more competitive? And so I think a lot of people kind of discounted it as the big strategic masterpiece that the individuals who wrote it says it is.
Well, let's talk about the new administration then. Some are talking about a reset with Beijing. Others are saying that's the wrong approach. I think there is a bit of a new consensus, you tell me, among Democrats and Republicans about the problem, the diagnostics that you were referring to, that really does start with that national security strategy paper from 2017. Our colleague H.R. McMaster, by the way, was one of the principal authors of that. But how does that affect what the Biden approach to China will be? And how do you suspect it'll be different from Trump? And how will it be similar?
So the conventional wisdom is that there's this broad consensus among Democrats and Republicans who focus on China. We have all, realized that we're in this competition with China, that, engagement and cooperation won't solve all of our problems. And on the surface, it does seem like there's a lot of agreement, but there are significant differences in perceptions. And there's sort of two main ones. The first one is, what is the source of the threat? And the
Right.
second is, what should we do to deal with it? So the source of the threat, if I can generalize, the Trump administration, and I would say largely conservatives, believe the source of this threat is inherent to the fact that China is an autocratic communist regime. Meaning there's nothing that China can do. It's not about Chinese behavior per se, it's about who China is. And that leads to their prescription of what to do, which is just to actively undermine China at every turn.
Right.
I think the Biden administration, if you look at his, potential, appointments so far, suggest a different approach. Their view is that China is a challenge and is a threat to the United States because of how it's defined under Xi Jinping, its interests, and how it's pursuing those interests. But that could change theoretically. And the way to deal with it is not a sort of direct confrontational approach, but instead to build US power and influence through international institutions and through allies and partnerships, a kind of coalition approach, that is the best way to convince Beijing to take on a different approach. So I think, President-elect Biden has said this is not a third Obama term. So I don't think they're going to fall into the trap of believing that sort of reassurance cooperation will build goodwill with Beijing, and then this will help us solve future issues. I don't think they're going to go with a reset in that respect, but I do think they're going to try to change how the United States competes, and also to signal to Beijing that it's not US policy to sort of undermine their rise. Instead, we are hoping that China is just a more, responsible actor in the international system.
That's really interesting because, in fact, we skipped over the Kennedy-esque part, but of course, those were exactly the debates that we had about the rise of the Soviet Union, whether it was about communism or power. And it sounds like there's an echo of that moving forward with China.
I mean, the difference is that the Soviet Union, I would say, besides them being so different, China and the Soviet Union, it's actually much more challenging to deal with China than it is with the Soviet Union for a number of reasons. And I'll just sort of lay out quickly
Yeah,
a few.
I
The
think that's
first,
fantastic.
yeah. So, as a strategist, people always said, oh, we dealt with the Soviet Union. Why can't you deal with China? And I always think it's an unfair comparison. I mean, the first is what we're trying to deter. So if you imagine, I'm not a Russia expert, so maybe you could correct me on this, but if you imagine before Russia became the Soviet Union, if we tried to deter Russia from becoming the Soviet Union, if we basically said, you cannot have that sphere of influence, how difficult that would have been, right? So what we're trying to tell China is you can't have these territories that you think are yours. We're trying to deter this like most basic unfulfilled ambition. And on top of that, we don't have the resources. If you look at, US resources versus Soviet Union resources, I mean, the United States was at a great advantage.
Right.
And there's also, we don't have a mutually assured destructive relationship in terms of nuclear weapons.
Right.
And so maybe we're both incorrect, but I will tell you that US military planners and Chinese military planners both are preparing for limited wars with each other. Maybe people think that's crazy, that it would escalate to the nuclear level, but most people don't believe that. So there is a real possibility of hot war. And on top of that, the Trump administration wants, and I think, if the strategy worked, it'd be great, but I don't think it will work, wants to convince people that this is an ideological, existential threat to the United States. But China is not this revolutionary, dangerous power in the same way that the Soviet Union was.
Right.
They don't have to build a wall to keep people in the country. A lot of Chinese nationals willingly go back. Now, of course, there are pockets of totalitarianism, Xinjiang being one of the most notable right now. But there is an attractiveness to working with China. So right now, I think our policy is to tell countries like, don't take the 5G, don't take the BRI money. It's bad for you. But they don't believe it because there is an attractive nature to China that is hard for the United States to contend with. So for a few of these reasons, it's very hard to compete with China and also to deter China from engaging in aggressive actions.
Great analogies and this undermining the analogies, by the way, in dealing with the Soviet Union. You're absolutely right. And the challenges I do think are greater for the reasons you just described. Talk a little bit, you alluded to it, but I want you to dig a little deeper into it about how you think the Biden administration might change its behavior, policy, engagement with our allies in the region. Continuities versus differences there. After all, that was a key part of how we dealt with the Soviet Union, was our alliance system. What's going on in that space, and what do you think might change in a new Biden era?
So I think the Biden administration will try to strengthen the allies and partnerships that the United States has. And what this means is allowing for the United States to have more influence with these countries, to shape how these countries also approach China, because China is not greatly deterred by vertical escalation. So what that means is that the threats of costs on China for using force, if the United States says like we'll respond with force in kind, and then there'll be higher levels of violence that will impose costs on you, China is not very deterred by that, because what they're after is of such benefit to them that it's very hard for the United States to impose those costs. But they are very concerned about horizontal escalation. And what that means is the involvement of many countries in a coalition against them. And so just to give you a very concrete example, if China thinks they have to fight the United States to gain Taiwan back into the fold, they'll do it if they think they can win. If they think that they are going to then be diplomatically isolated and have their relationships harmed for the long term with not only the United States, but Japan, with Australia, with Europe, with Southeast Asia, then they won't do it. And so the allies and partnerships really do strengthen the US competitive edge, but they also strengthen the deterrent. One of the other issues, though, of why deterrence is hard in Asia versus in Europe is most of the conflicts that we're trying to deter are air and sea based, where you can't put a tripwire, right? So our strategy for deterring the Soviet Union was, put Americans physically in the way so
Right.
that the Soviet Union would have to overrun them. And so this signals US willingness to support its allies and partners. But, the South China Sea is the size of half the continental United States. I mean, there's no way to position the United States to say, like, we will defend the Philippines. The Taiwan Strait is smaller, but it's the same issue. It's always an independent decision for the United States to get involved. And so this is also what makes it hard for our promises to defend our allies and partners to be credible. And that difficulty is going to continue into the Biden administration. The question is, whether China sees a strengthening of the overall relationship beyond military, economic, diplomatic, as a deterrent as well.
Right. Well, dig a little bit more into Taiwan. Tell us a little bit more about what's going on there. We Americans have been so distracted with our own domestic dramas. I don't think we've been paying much attention. And what do you think the Biden team will do differently with respect to our relations with Taiwan?
There has been a change in the balance of power across the Taiwan Strait in the past couple of years. So historically, people often, and even now, will bring up, will the United States defend Taiwan? And people
Right.
think this is the critical issue. This is the factor that influences Beijing's decision making. That was the case when we had the last Taiwan Straits crisis, in 1996, which was now, 25 years ago? That's a very long time ago. A lot has
Right.
happened since then. Beijing no longer is deterred by the prospect of US intervention. They don't ask, will the United States intervene? They ask, will the United States prevail? It's now uncertainty about US capabilities. And so this shift in Beijing's perspective of, like, even if the United States defends Taiwan, we can still win. And this shift has largely happened because of their own military modernization efforts, which accelerated after 2013 to allow them to engage in joint operations. And they just, for the first time in a couple of decades, released a new operational doctrine that focuses on this joint operational concept that allows them to take Taiwan by force if they would like to. All of this makes them more confident in the military tools. And so domestically, for the first time, there's a debate in China that they should move away from this peaceful reunification approach, which is, get more connected with Taiwan economically, and then the people of Taiwan will decide they want to be a part of mainland China,
Right.
towards what they now call armed reunification. And so this, on top of the fact that the leader of China, Xi Jinping, has said that he wants to see concrete progress towards reunification, which none of us know exactly what that means.
It means, right. Yeah.
But it's not good, makes a lot of people concerned that China's, at the very least, if they're confident that they have the option to take Taiwan by force, at the very least, they're going to be more aggressive, short of force, feeling like they can escalate if they want to. So this is the world that the Biden administration is going to come into. And the question is, what are they going to do differently than the Trump administration? I think there are some people in the Trump administration that really care about defending Taiwan, and that's why they've pushed for this more aggressive US policy. But there are also some people that maybe don't care about Taiwan, but they just want to poke China in the eye. Going back to my previous comment about some people just hating China because it's an autocratic communist country. And so I
Right.
think what you'll see from the Biden administration is a lot less of that symbolism. Like, if it doesn't have an impact on helping Taiwan or defending Taiwan, the United States is not going to unnecessarily provoke Beijing. And I think the Biden administration is also going to try to expand Taiwan's international space through the mechanisms we talked about before. I mean, it's very hard to fight back to get Taiwan back into, like, the World Health Assembly if the United States is pulled out of the World Health Organization, right?
Well,
So,
that's a good
I
point.
think the Biden administration is going to be much more active about its international engagement, and hopefully that will provide more opportunities for Taiwan to have more international space.
That sounds pretty scary, though, what you just described with respect to Taiwan. I mean, how I know these are absurd. This is an absurd question, so don't answer it if you don't want to. But probabilistically, is conflict with China over Taiwan something you worry about happening within years, or is it something further down the road, or is it something we can still
Uh,
avoid?
2028 to 2035 is
Okay,
the window.
all right,
Like based on base so I will tell you though, in my discussions and interviews with the Chinese military, they think they'll be ready sooner. I've
right.
actually talked to some Chinese military people that think that they're ready now. Um, n- they're not. They're not. I mean, I just
It's good
they
news.
have to obviously. Yes, I mean it's good news, but their confidence is what determines their decision making, right? So the issue is, you know, do they have all the equipment they need? And they were focused in the initial stages of modernization on getting the most advanced weapons, most advanced systems. Since 2013, they've focused on organization, human capital. Like, can their people actually fight? Are their people actually trained to use this equipment in effective ways? They think they're now at the kind of tail end of that process that should be finished by, like, you know, 2024, 2025. But then I think, given that Taiwan is so important, they have to test it. I really do think they have to see. It's one thing to say we've done realistic training. It's another thing to see something, you know, in the fog of war. So I think unless Taiwan declares independence or there's some reason Beijing is forced to take action before they're quote unquote ready, my prediction is on an island grabbing in the South China Sea as a test case, because it's a similar type of operation,
Right.
to see how they perform, um, and to, you know, go over lessons learned, hone their approach, and then consider Taiwan.
It's very sobering. You mentioned the way the Chinese, you were talking about military, but tell us just more broadly, what is the reaction of the Chinese leadership to Biden's election? But also tell us about any other groups that might matter. Do they see this as a good moment for U.S.-China relations? Or are they kind of agnostic? I'm just kind of curious what the reaction has been so far. In Moscow, for instance, it's been very negative. How are they reacting in Beijing?
I think there is a mixed reaction. There's a lot of discussion. Some people are saying Trump was better. Some people are saying Biden is better. I think what this really highlights is an anxiety about the current state of US China relations
Right,
and an uncertainty about how we got here and how we get out. And so that uncertainty is then being projected onto understandings of Biden versus Trump. Um, you know, which one would be better or worse? One thing I will say is that the elites in China, you know, starting from when President Trump first came into power, were saying over and over in exchanges, this is just a President Trump thing. It's just that President Trump doesn't like China. Individuals like myself in these track 1.5s, track 2s, constantly reiterated, you know, he might have a unique approach, but there is a general consensus that we don't like how you're acting and we, you know, want that to change. And that, you know, I used to always say the national security strategy, when it was published, I never saw more happier Democrats, you know, like Obama appointees that were like, oh, finally someone said it, you know, finally we can compete. And so
right,
now I'm seeing a lot of those elite writings acknowledging the fact that this isn't the problems aren't going to go away with President Trump. Now, the biggest problem, though, if you saw Fu Ying, a former ambassador, she wrote an op-ed for the New York Times,
yep,
in which she took a very standard approach, which I wrote an op-ed in response to, which is kind of like, uh, it's I call it gaslighting. They're like, nothing is happening, nothing you say is real. It's all in your imagination and it's all in your head, and that's been their strategy this whole time, and it's just not working anymore. You know, they
right,
can say all day long, like, we are just a peace-loving people, we've never attacked anyone else, like, we have no nefarious intentions, it's just all misunderstanding. But everyone's looking at their behavior actions, and so multiple things that they've done, and until they recognize that, there's no hope that Xi Jinping is going to consider a different strategy. And so
right,
that's why I think a reset is not really possible. Even if Biden tries it, Beijing's going to react in such a way that that's going to be quickly abandoned.
right. I mean, it is striking as an observer, not an expert, how Trump has done all these mistakes and alienated all kinds of allies around the world, withdrew from all these international organizations. And yet you wouldn't look at the past 4 years to say that Xi Jinping has taken great advantage of that. It doesn't seem like they're in a better position in that international community you were talking about, which suggests that it will be very difficult just to change things immediately. Having said that, maybe my last question, I'm trying to think of one little piece of good news that we can end on. Are there some easy issues, even on the unilateral side, that, by the way, that maybe Xi Jinping, if he wants a better relationship with Washington, are there things that he could do to signal that he wants to change the dynamic? And conversely, are there small things that the Biden administration could do to change the dynamic, or not?
So I think there are things that can be done, but I wouldn't take the small issue approach. I mean, we've tried this before with Beijing, in which we cooperate on smaller issues like the lowest hanging fruit. We think that's going to build will that we can then translate into gains in other areas. It doesn't work. Everyone goes home frustrated and disappointed. What I think we need to do is to be bold and think about the issues, the conflicting interests that are coloring all of our interactions with Beijing. And I think actually there is room for discussion on these. So like the South China Sea, for example, I have talked to people in China, government, military, who have said they are willing to reconsider their position on the fact that all the waters of the South China Sea are theirs and that they can regulate activities there. If the United States reconsiders its position on how far away you can conduct surveillance and reconnaissance, from the specific islands. When I go back to the Pentagon and I sort of present this, the American side will say, oh yeah, we'd be more than willing to operate a bit farther out if China revised its position on the EEZ, but China would never agree to it. And then I go to Beijing and they say, oh my gosh, we would totally be willing to agree to that, but the Pentagon would never agree to it, right? So I think there are actually some areas where we could come to an agreement. Now, of course, there's some things that are indivisible, like, Taiwan. We're not going to say, okay, Beijing, you can have Taiwan. But there are, so I think we need to start, just like with the normalization process, we need to start with the big issues and say, how can we continue to improve our relationship, try for peace and stability in the rest of the world, even given that these issues are going to continue. And just to end on a final positive note, one of the things that is very different about China and the United States versus the United States and the Soviet Union is that there's no hostility between the Chinese people and the American people. Right. Like, as much as I talk about, because it's my job to study militarization and conflict, I have tons of Chinese friends. I love spending time in Beijing, right? Most of my friends who are there that have very strong nationalistic views were all educated back in the United States, right? The problem is not that we don't like each other. I actually think the problem is we're too similar. We're two countries that think we are exceptional, that the rules don't apply to us, and that our natural place is on top. Right. And so I think this does change the dynamic, that it can be more pragmatic and less emotional in terms of how we deal with it.
I think that's a great place to end. Go big. And maybe let's continue that in a further conversation once we know what the whole scope of the Biden team is, and to talk about some of those contours the next time we have you on the podcast.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing the announcement of the rest of the team.
Me too. You've been listening to World Class from the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. If you like what you're hearing, please review us on Apple Podcasts. We'd love to know your thoughts. And be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever you're listening to stay up to date on what's happening in the world and why.